I'm Richard Holloway. I did a talk here sometime last year, some of you may have come to, and you invited me back, which is very nice. So thank you for having me. Okay, so first one about me, right? So I've been working in banking technology for over 20 years for a range of banks, HSBC, RBS, others like State Street and Deutsche Bank I spent a bit of time for as well. I've covered many project delivery roles, both in Agile and sort of more traditional project methodologies. Most recently, I'd probably say the last 4 or 5 years, it's probably been exclusively Agile. I've done roles like Scrum Masters, I've done product owner roles, I've done project manager, delivery manager roles, and BA roles within those teams. Sometimes we've done them very strictly, you know, the way that you probably expect them to exist in an Agile world. And sometimes it's been, for example, product owner, but you're the project manager really in some sort of morphing role. So that's me, sort of bulk of my professional life. I am an iOS app hack, so I have written some iOS apps, which is about as close as I get to development these days, or hands-on development coding. I also blog at agiledevil.com. There's the stuff on there, so please come and visit. We'd love to see you there. Okay, so about this talk. Last time I came, I did a talk about a bank that I had some experience with. And that was about a journey that they were making in terms of trying to introduce something called industrialized Agile, which is essentially enterprise Agile. This is about a different bank. I'm still on pain of death, not allowed to tell you who it is. I'm sure there'll be some clues in there. My LinkedIn profile might give it away. I may even slip and actually tell you who it is at some point, but it is a big, huge banking organization. Okay, so no names provided to protect the innocent. Also, as I said last time as well, my last speech, right, I'm certainly not taking credit for any of the good things that happened here. And equally, I'm not going to take the blame for all the bad things that happened. I've been part and parcel of this project. There are many catalysts involved on this project there, and I'm one of a few. Okay, right, so in the beginning. So once upon a time, this bank, it had a huge program to deliver. Okay, like many organisations that I've come across, there was a view that we wanted to do it with agility, right? But this is probably more along the lines of being told to do Agile rather than being Agile in the way that we were approaching things. There were probably about 60 developers on this program. There were delivery managers. This program, if you like, was split up into a number of different pods responsible for delivering different bits of the program. Those pods contained QAs and BAs, as you probably expect. One of the key goals of this was that they had a legacy Flex application. That means anything to anybody. They wanted to move it onto HTML. There's all sorts of benefits of doing that these days. We've got much bigger potential user base. The technology tends to be better and more flexible, more responsive for things like mobile. Also, this application, although it was being used internally, we realized that our customers could actually use it for self-service as well. Now, traditionally within this banking organization, this product, this sector hadn't really done anything in the external space. So the idea was to do something that was considered modern, user-friendly enough that we could push it out externally as well. Okay, it's a global base as well. It's a traditional sort of 3-center banking model that people may have come across. Okay, big London, big New York, big Asian presence. So this needed to go out into those hubs globally. Also, wanted to point out, this wasn't a blue sky greenfield project. Okay, lots of the services for things like pricing in a banking environment, credit checking, customer databases, all these things we had to integrate with. Okay, so as well as doing sort of what you probably see as maybe the more funky HTML stuff, we had to build out a lot of services to integrate with other established services that have been within the bank for a long time. In different regions, these services connected to different applications and so on. So there's this complex, big legacy infrastructure that we had to deal with as well. So that's where this program started. Now this releasing software in this environment, despite the drive towards agility, it was tricky, right? Because of the size of the changes that we were pushing out, the number of different touch points to other systems and things. Despite the attempts to do agility, we tended to fall into a cycle where we would get software ready and then go through extensive testing cycles, right? And so for this reason, we tended to probably not do more than one release per quarter on this program. as I said, all these releases were huge. You know, if you do kind of stagger your releases out in that fashion, these releases tend to pick up more and more stuff. We had a lot of red tape. The sort of whole change process around getting any of this stuff done was extraordinary. Again, I suspect many people are coming into contact with these things. You know, if you don't raise your change request within a couple of months, it's deemed an emergency. And then there's an exception letter, and there's change freezes, and there are DR windows, and all these other things which actually stop you kind of executing plan maybe in the way that you would have first drawn it out. There are long testing cycles as well. The end-to-end nature of the sort of stuff that we were dealing with at this time, we touched so many different systems, and often there would be changes in those systems as well. It wasn't just the front end we were bolting on to these services. So there's loads of dependencies, loads of handoffs, different teams working on related development at a similar time that had to come together. And also, I'd have to say as well, this is probably the most data-obsessed culture I've ever been involved with, right? So slipping a day, a couple of days, even on these releases, maybe because they were so infrequent, I don't know, but it was a big deal, okay? One of the mantras that used to come down a lot of the time was, you know, do it with agility, but do it on time, okay? So that's really where we were. This is how the program started. But then we had a disaster with one of our releases, okay? I'm going to call this a cross-project disaster, right? One of these big releases had all the attributes of things we just covered, went live, and it caused absolute chaos. It took the banks, the particular trading area that we're talking about here, it took that out of operation in production for 2 days, right? So it's a major big deal. And as I said, this release had many of the attributes that we just saw on the previous slide, right? So many applications were changing at once, plenty of breaking changes, right? There was no sense that just one application could be rolled back here to get things back to a working state. Everything had to be pulled back. Next two bullets really, I mean, many man months of dev and QA typically means you're going to have a huge release with loads of changes in it, loads of different moving parts, loads of changes, loads of features. There are many complex dependencies, many handoffs between different teams. As I said, it left a trail of disaster in its wake, both in terms of what it did when it went live, when people noticed it wasn't behaving as expected, the complexity of rolling it back wasn't straightforward. And also this was actually just releasing software back to a working state. We also had an issue that trades were being sent around the organization with the wrong attributes. And I would say we probably do about 1,000 trades a day probably at this point. And they were all going to the wrong places. The wrong people were picking them up to manage risk and all sorts of things. So even with the software back to a working state, there was a big reconciliation effort to try and get this organization back up and running trading again. So yes, big disastrous project. Okay, and this is a point where the SWAT team arrived. Okay. Now, what I think is really interesting about this, I've been around organizations enough trying to do Agile, where, you know, some people may think, well, okay, it's really difficult to actually get these things done in a big organization. It's very easy to read books and think, yeah, why don't we all do stories? Why don't we all do story points? And, okay, in my experience, the only times when actually things have really been successfully moved into an Agile state are when people take some drastic action and maybe some things you wouldn't normally predict. What I thought was really interesting with this program was that I think a normal mode, again, in my experience, to deal with this sort of thing, we'd have a huge post-mortem, big retrospective, right? Find out all the things that have gone wrong. And you probably end up with things coming out of it like, okay, we need to do some more testing next time. We need to do some more planning next time. We need to test that area that we forgot to test. But what I thought was really interesting about this, and I thought was key to the way that this program transformed, was they asked themselves this question instead, you know, how do we want to deliver software and change? Are we delivering software in a way that we should be? So rather than casting around in postmortems for root causes, actually looked at the whole way that we were trying to deliver software and change. The other significant point here is that I think it'd be really tempting as well to kind of keep on going. You know, you look at the next release, you fix the things that went wrong, and you push out new versions of your software. But they didn't do that. They actually stopped the program, and they introduced a SWAT team, right? So the SWAT team came, and they started to pull apart the whole process, the way that actually software was being built and delivered. And really at the core of that was understanding a set of principles that they wanted to stick to, right? These actually, as we go through them, these could apply to any methodology, right? Not necessarily just Agile. What I think is interesting about all of these as we go through them, we realized that nearly any production issue, any major incident that we'd had over an extended period of time, you could probably trace it back to breaking one of these principles, okay? So these principles started becoming a mantra around everything that we did, okay? So the first one is nothing is more important than production. We were aware at the time there was a big distance between people who actually wrote software and then just shoved it onto a tester's work stack, and then the tester would send that to somebody in support would release it. But there's a big distance between the people actually writing the code and the people who were using it, right? So nothing is more important than production sort of manifested itself in things like if you had a production incident, the correction of that production incident would be top of the stack, right? Nothing else would matter. And in an organization obsessed with dates, this was really a crucial change, because what that meant sometimes is you'd be telling somebody your project is late, we've had production incidents, okay? Having this accepted as a principle meant that, you could play this as a trump card all the time, right? Nothing's more important than production. We are going to fix that production issue. There may be impacts elsewhere. It also, the other thing that it did, it gave us the ability to go and start putting people in support roles, right? So in this organization, even now, everybody at any level, regardless of discipline, spends time pairing with support on a rota, okay? And during that time, they're told to forget about their day job, forget the meetings, forget stand-ups, even in an Agile world for that day. You're on support, you're going to be pairing with somebody in production, right? That could be a quiet day, there could be things going wrong, but it's a learning process, and it's sort of helped change attitudes. Okay, so the next thing, this is sort of a very typical Agile lean principle. We realized that we weren't getting working software into the hands of end users, right? We were kind of getting software out, but it wasn't working, and it certainly wasn't going quickly. So we started to think about how we can actually make that happen, okay? And the way that initially started happening with us was that although the teams were following sprints, those sprints were development based, they would accumulate change and then do one of these big releases like the one we talked about in the disaster. What we set out to do here, though, was trying to release at the end of every sprint. Okay, sorry, yes, release at the end of every sprint. This other one, this point as well was crucial. One of the reasons that changes started to accumulate, we realized, was because there were dependencies between different bits of work. So, for example, you're building two systems that are meant to talk to each other over an API. The API might couple those releases in some way. So you kind of put out one side, but then you had to wait till the other side is ready to actually do that piece as well. So what we tried to set up instead was sort of a mass simplification of our development process, so that every change that wasn't complete would be behind a toggle, and people are sort of familiar with that concept. So what you're doing is actually kind of moving work in progress out of the way so that people can still work on that code, even if there's work in progress in it. But until your change is done and tested and untoggled, it's harmless. So everybody can work on the same code base. You can release software on a regular basis without having to worry too much. You have to worry a little bit sometimes because not everything is as simple as just hiding it away behind a toggle. But nonetheless, there is that mantra, like no breaking changes, right? If somebody was found to be putting some software out and was held back because of some unfinished change elsewhere, that was seen as bad, right? And another reason why some of our implementations sometimes failed. Okay, and everybody must participate in end-to-end delivery. So I've already talked about the way in which people, regardless of role and discipline, would start picking up supporting roles. What we also wanted to do is get people involved with that step of actually releasing software into production, okay? Getting the support guys at the beginning of the process as well, so they could actually introduce stories about what they wanted. Okay, so rather than releasing software being in this privileged position of somebody with a production access account to release your software, we wanted everybody in the team to get involved with that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so that's how the team was set up. And we kind of got to a point where the dam burst, right? What the SWAT team also enabled us to do is to start a DevOps pilot. I think the shock of some of the things that happened during that project opened some eyes in senior managers, and they agreed to kind of let us try some different things in terms of how we release software. Okay, so we were given, I think it was a 12-week period to actually try this out, and certain allowances were made for us. Okay, so the first ones was no lead time for raising changes. Okay. So after a period of time, we were releasing software in general every couple of weeks, sometimes longer, depending on the nature of the change. We weren't always very good at kind of pushing stuff out with sprints. But we kind of moved from a model of kind of raising all our change requests at the beginning of the sprint for the end of the sprint and then moving them as we needed to being able to actually raise change requests whenever we needed them with little or no lead time. Okay, we're also sent for no change freeze windows. So again, some of these bureaucracy, red tape things, I'd say as well, this is in a limited context. So this is within our application. So we were sort of sandboxed a little bit from causing any damage by operating outside of change freeze windows. Also, a big thing was, again, it was kind of quite common that people approving change maybe are kind of quite distanced from the people actually going to end up using that change. So we had a change control team, and we used to have to nag these people to kind of get our changes approved, even though the business had approved it, technologists had approved it, everyone's happy with it. We still had to go to a change team and get them to do some work from us. Again, we were exempted to do that. And another sort of key feature of this, and we'll come on to this in some of the other slides as well, was that the change requests themselves contained very little detail, but what they did contain was a link to information that the teams prepared themselves. And what this meant was that we weren't hemmed into sort of a standard template that fitted the whole bank. We were able to kind of create these release pages with the information that we thought was important. So the change request just referred to those pages and not much else. Okay. Now, what this meant was that so one of the things that led to this as well was that somebody did an estimate at the beginning of that year, and said that if every change that we anticipated we release at the end of a sprint went in, the cost of actually having somebody to manually enter those changes would be about £1 million per annum, right? So that helps sort of focus minds in terms of moving us on to that DevOps process and getting some changes done. As we started doing this as well, we were able to prove that the number of incidents that occurred with more frequent releases didn't go up, right? So although we were releasing fortnightly, production incidents and things just remained static, right? We still had the occasional incident with releases, but the amount of incidents we had over a given period of time didn't go up. So sort of proving, I guess, that the way that we were doing things at this point hadn't introduced any extra risk. In fact, was safer. I think another critical thing that we had, that we had to kind of enforce a lot of discipline within the teams around what we were doing. So although we were kind of creating our own release documentation, linking through from that, it's very important, very critical that things on there were exactly correct. The number of, as an example, we had things like testing evidence. We had an exact list of all the changes that were in that release, and we had to enforce this rigorously, because this was one of the things that gave us a license to operate with this DevOps pilot. Showing that we had and were capable of producing, good, well-written, disciplined documentation ourselves. Okay. And another sort of key aspect of the way that this whole change process started changing was that our business had bought into this, right? We already discussed how when we had this big incident, right, we had the business's backing, our business stakeholders, to actually kind of pull the plug on the program temporarily and get things set up properly. And all of these things together helped us to able to actually start challenging that change process. Okay, there's a really good quote as well. This is from one of the support people. If you really want to challenge things in big organizations where there's lots of controls and lots of people concerned around risk management and incidents and support people and so on, if you actually want to kind of change the way that things are done, you often have to just demonstrate that you're in control, right? I've got some fresh examples in mind of things that happened relatively recently where there are times where we realize that we're not in control, and you realize that if you own that state, you may actually lose the license to operate in this way. Okay, so what happened next? Right, so or continue testing, finish off testing, right? And so many of the teams I was involved with at the time said things, well, we have to freeze the code on day 7. Of course, what this means as a developer, you can get involved with some testing, but what does that mean? When you budget for your sprint, you only budget for 7 days. And then there was this whole thing as well about what we call the great regression debate. If you're releasing every 2 weeks, should your regression be exactly the same as the stuff that you're pushing out every 3 months if you're doing quarterly releases? And the temptation was to do exactly that, right? Who knows what those developers might have touched. There could be all sorts of dependencies within the code you don't understand. And we just need to regression test everything. Now, of course, regression testing everything on days 7, 8, 9, 10 of a sprint is a huge challenge, right? So this whole sort of mindset change we realized that we needed to take on here. Do we need to read the code on day 7? Do we need to regression test everything? We're doing smaller releases here, right? So can we be a bit more trusting of the type of changes that have gone in? Can we do some automation? So for a while at least, this was a big challenge for us. Okay. So another issue that we had around about that time was that even though when we started off releasing fortnightly, we probably had like 4 or 5 releases at the time. 4 or 5 people actually had the access to go in and actually kind of push these changes out. What we started finding over time, bearing in mind that some of these changes had to go in out of hours as well, so as not to disrupt trading hours, and we just didn't have enough people. So as people got quicker, and even people started doing these releases at the end of every sprint, there weren't enough people to actually do these things. So that was a bit of a problem for us, and we used to sort of fight over those individuals for a while who could actually do those things for us. I think another thing that happened initially, which wasn't particularly great, was that the fortnight can be quite a long time for a big code base. And what we realized, instead of replacing these infrequent big releases with frequent small releases, we actually went to a state where we actually realized we're actually releasing frequently but huge changes, right? So if you looked at any of our release pages around about this time, every fortnight you see a list of maybe 100 different tickets that have gone into a release. And it was terrifying, right? So we kind of exactly which ways we actually managed to kind of mitigate the risk of pushing out change like this all the time. Also, I mean, the importance of discipline I've touched on as well. As you get faster, as you do more releases, you're creating more of these release pages. You create more potential areas where that discipline might not be great. And we had to be really careful around making sure that people were doing the right things, writing up things the right way. Okay, and the number of releases per week grew during this time as well. We did actually get to a point around about this time where we were releasing at the end of every sprint. There was a bit of gaming here. We'll sort of touch upon this at the end as well. We had things, there was a challenge to actually get releases done every week at one point. And teams suddenly realized, okay, well, if I'm doing an internal release to my internal customers, and I'm releasing that exact same software the week after, that's counted as another release. So it did cross several minds about whether, as a metric, although we were tracking the number of releases, was that the right thing to track? I'll come back to that. I think it's important. Okay. So around about this time, we hit another problem. So the teams in general were working a little bit better. One of the things that we started realizing was that we have far too much work in progress in any given team. Okay, I think there's a classic example some people might have seen where you look at a sprint board in the middle of a sprint, and you get halfway through the sprint, half your stories are in progress, but nothing's completed, right? And we had this sort of classic sort of pattern at the time where we would kind of do a whole bunch of stories in the sprint. We'd done all the estimation. We thought we could get them all done, but you get to the end of the sprint, maybe only 2 out of the 10 are ready to go. Okay, so you do your fortnightly release, and that kind of pushes out everything that's ready. But you had a whole bunch of stuff that was just rolled over. Okay, so I think it's a common problem in many sort of initial implementations of sprint and Agile. And so around about this time, we sort of realized this and addressed it and said, okay, right, we need to limit WIP, right? So we had our sprint boards, we had our columns to do, dev, testing. We actually put a limit on our tools that said that that could only be a certain value. And that was all an effort to kind of, let's say we want to get 3 stories completed in a sprint. That's better than having one.
Muted.
About
Unmuted.
that time. I can bring all these slides up, actually, all these points. What that also led into, of course, is that when we got ourselves into this state where, as an example, we had a testing column with loads and loads of stories, loads of work in, say 10, right? A team of 5 or 6 people, they've suddenly created 10 stories that are a QA stage, right? What we were seeing around about this time was that developers would pick up the next story, and then there'd be 11 stories in the QA column. And what we realized that we had to do by limiting WIP was that we had to have what we call T-shaped people, which is maybe a term that some people may have heard of. So, what do you do when that developer has just finished a story? Does he go into 11th story? What should he do? Should he just down tools because that WIP stuff's done? And that's where we realized that sort of new behaviors were required to actually help us in this model, right? So the T-shape refers to sort of a depth of knowledge in one particular area, but having a bit of breadth in other areas as well, right? So when a developer, for example, sees that there's stuff absolutely stuffed into the QA column, it's saying, okay, right, I can do some testing here, right? I might have to pair with somebody to get up to speed. I might be able to do some automation, but having that sort of little bit of breadth of knowledge to actually get involved and help clear out these queues and get things done rather than picking the story. I think this is really sort of key stage in the development of this program, because what we realized back in that sort of SWAT team phase I was referring to, when sort of the bank's program broke down, there were sort of 4 or 5 key individuals, absolutely new systems inside out, absolutely brilliant developers technically, but they're not necessarily these T-shaped people. And what we realized was at this point, when we kind of got to this stage in the development of this program, you could probably have maybe not your sort of best technical developers actually working on this stuff. It was almost like you wanted people to kind of have those behaviors, be prepared to kind of pick up stuff that might not have been sort of their key strength. But that's what it would take to actually kind of get things done. Now, optimizing systems, not individuals, is a lean term some of you may have come across. But during this phase, when we did things like put key developer on the support role for a day, we put a key developer, there's always a developer as well, it can be testers, BAs, whatever. We put one of these guys on release duty, so all day on a shift, they would be kind of releasing software. Some people said, well, you're paying me to be a developer, I've got big development skills, you're not getting the most efficiency out of me. And what we realized, this is a classic case of this lean theory, right? The minute you start kind of saying, well, he's a great developer, just spend a whole day developing, we'll find somebody else to do all the release stuff or the support stuff. What you're doing is actually optimizing locally, with the individual. So we needed to sort of shift that pattern. That's sort of an ongoing cultural debate. There are some people who sort of fit into this role. There are others that don't. What we realized is that for the success of the program at this point, we probably needed more of the T-shaped people rather than the I-shaped people. Okay. So around about this time, we realized that our teams were too big. I'm going to bring these all up again, actually, to talk about all these at once. So we reached this sort of stage where we were generally trying to release every 2 weeks. Having some success with that, we'd implemented our WIP limits. But we were also at this stage of our program, we were, if you like, rather than having the classic sort of front to back team, so each team, there's probably about 6 teams at this point, so I should point that out. Rather than each of those teams being able to operate independently, we had a team who looked after a front end, a team who looked after a back end, a team who looked after pricing. So we still tended to have this handoff and dependency model between the different teams to try and get a working piece of functionality out to our customers. So what we started doing around about this time as well was mixing the teams up a bit. So the team I looked after was heavily Java-based because that's what server software was written in. Another team was full of JavaScript, HTML, CSS guys. We actually started merging them. Now, of course, what that meant as well was that we, so it was in general a good thing, be able to work on front to back stories. But it also meant that we started having challenges around everybody checking into the same code at the same time, right? No longer had you got the front end team with a front end code base. You now had everybody checking into it around about the same time, which was good, but had some challenges, right? So this avoiding breaking changes that we talked about earlier just became absolutely critical. People can be checking into your code without knowing about it, without you realizing what they were doing until the point at which you come to kind of push out a release. And that's where this whole thing about toggling, just a single master branch of code without branching out and merging, which maybe is a typical pattern, that became absolutely critical because you could easily be hijacked. What we also realized around about this time, we started releasing intra-sprint. So that sort of great regression debate thing that I was referring to earlier, that started going away, right? People started changing behavior. And we kind of got to the point where we said, okay, if the story is the right size, the story is done, let's release it now. Okay, lots of that release tax had started to go away, the things we referred to earlier about, release lead, so change lead windows, change freeze windows, all those things are starting to go away. So we started saying, if it's that straightforward, we've got a dedicated person releasing, why don't we release when things are ready? Okay, so this was actually, again, so another key stage where instead of getting to the end of a sprint, we finish a couple of stories and we think, okay, time to actually push this thing into production. Why can't we? What that meant, this is the first time this has happened in my career. I'm a big sprint person, big scrum person, the sort of the 2-week window, and resetting yourself and working out what you're going to do the next 2 weeks has generally been a feature of much of my work in Agile, right? But you start realizing that when you're releasing software into sprint the way that we were, why are we using Scrum anymore, right? What is the point of sprints and velocity, right? Sort of the classic Scrum model, if you like, is deciding what you're going to release in 2 weeks' time and trying to get all those stories you're committed to done and out into production. But if you're releasing intra-sprint, do you need sprints anymore? Equally, if you're doing that, I mean, velocity, what typically would you use velocity for in an Agile world? Well, it tends to be budgeting for sprints. So if you don't have sprints, you probably don't need velocity for that purpose anymore. And it tends to be for forecasting as well. But what we found around about this time as well, that the more frequent releases meant that people were actually starting to focus less on dates. So again, that sort of opportunity to forecast had gone really. So we started dropping velocity, which meant also that we started looking at things like Kanban. And it was around about this time the Scrum boards started changing into Kanban boards, right? Which is actually kind of great as well. One of the challenges that we had early on was that when production incident did occur, I think in any sort of Scrum board you'll tend to get this challenge. It's like, okay, we're committed to these stories. We're not going to get some of these things done if there's also production incidents going on. I think that the Kanban actually really helped us at this point because the whole manifesto that we had and about nothing's more important than production, it just meant that we had that mandate to actually slot these stories in and not worry so much about missing committed stories at the end of sprints. Around about, we still saw around about this stage in the program that the incidence to release ratios were improving as well, right? So we'll talk a little bit in a moment about the benefits of doing this approach, but the releases tended to be smaller and more frequent as opposed to the point earlier on where I said they were more frequent but still big. And it was around about this time we started doing daily releases as well, okay? Now this is daily releases across the program at this point, not per team, okay? So across the 6 teams, and it takes one of those teams to do a release every week or so, and you kind of hit that point. Okay, so where are they now? I'm going to do the good, bad, and ugly, right? Okay. So what's been, at this point in this program's life cycle, the good things, right? So nearly everyone in the team has done a release, right? So rather than that being seen as a specialist position, everybody has kind of got their hands dirty and actually kind of push working software out. I should have put here as well, everybody has done these support shifts as well. Everyone kind of has that experience of actually supporting our user base. The figures are up to about 20 releases a day. So one of the more accurate stats I've heard back from around about this time, I think we went from 25 releases a year up to about 600 a year around about this point. Okay, we've built up a lot of trust as well. I mean, it's already sort of pointed out the data-driven, data-obsessed nature started going away, and people started to trust the approach. The fourth point there as well is actually a really big one for me, right? I'm the sort of project manager historically panics whenever software has gone out, right? You kind of think, hey, what's going to go wrong? What haven't I tested? What bit haven't we done, right? There's certainly a long period of my working career where I was just dreading kind of making changes, right? I'm sure lots of people have felt that too. But what I've found is that releasing frequently and not having those issues and the mop-ups and all the other things of a bad release, it just means that people are more confident. Things have gone wrong, right? I can think of several examples where there are flaws in this process. I'll touch upon some of them in a minute. But in general, you kind of think this release is going to work, right? Because it's small. There's only one change in it. We tested that change. I've got the testing evidence. Regression was small because it's only a small area that we've changed. So for me, as a project manager, this is like a big deal because you start to relax a bit and just be confident that something is going to work. As I said as well, we do tend to be less date-driven. Still tend to do occasionally sort of T-shirt sizing of a new piece of work. Somebody will say, if I wanted to do this, give me an idea of how long it would take. We still have to do that sort of thing, but it tends to drive whether we do something or not, rather than becoming the date that you are pinned to and committed to. So that's the good things. So the bad things, right? We've thoroughly broken the release process. One of the things I didn't sort of cover as we went through this was we tried to make releasing simple, right? So that people could do it. We had bash tools and wiki pages that described how to do this. But as you start doing this more often, right? So we got up to a point where we probably did, I think at peak, probably about 30 releases in a given day, right? There's still a lot of manual effort in actually pulling wiki pages together, pulling instructions together. And of course, when you do that, like the end of every sprint for 3 or 4 releases, that's one thing. When you're doing 30 a day consistently, things will go wrong. So we have broken it there. It's almost like the tools that helped us at a certain point needed to be iterated to actually help kind of increase that volume and support that volume. We also got to a point where we realized there wasn't literally enough time in the day to push change out, right? So we tended to focus all of our changes during a London working day, apart from the stuff that had to go out of hours. But we got to a point where the amount of work in actually pushing these changes out, which would involve, still getting change requests done, checking with some of the business are happy for you to do the release then. Doing the paperwork around that. So we still have these discipline of kind of creating wiki pages, closing change requests, doing a business checkout. We found that people were actually scheduling releases and there wasn't enough time to get through them all in a day. So there was a problem there. Right? We had to kind of think of other ways of doing it. We've only got one person dedicated to checking out on the business side. This seems a bad thing because, first of all, that one person isn't scaling. I mean, what you do is you increase, you just kind of hire more and more people to do your business checkouts. And also there was a view that actually you've just kind of solved a problem by just hiring somebody to do something. So that stat we had earlier about somebody estimated it would cost us £1 million to raise change just to fill out the change request. This is sort of probably another example of this, right? So we sped up. We just hired somebody whose sole job it is all day to go, yeah, that change has worked. Yeah, that change has worked. So it didn't feel like maybe it's the right way to actually solve that problem. And the no more handos is we had a customer going out every Friday, right? So the team, most people in the team would just go out to a local Nando's and have lunch, right? We were so whacked out at this point, kind of pushing out change and kind of checking things out and making sure things were scheduled and disciplined. Right? These sort of things just disappeared. So it didn't actually become like a great, fun place to work for a while. And the last point there about more automation, I mean, just in general, the things that we talked about, we realized that in order to kind of go any faster, or even actually to support the current volumes that they got up to at this point, you'd have to kind of add some more automation. Okay, so, and then I'm going to end on a positive note, but the ugly side of this, right? So beware the preachers, right? One thing which I noticed towards the end of this process in particular was that it was tend to be like a very evangelical, preachy attitude. And if somebody has sort of broken ranks and created a release page didn't have the right information on, we had things occasionally happening as well, like somebody had not checked a change was approved and pushed the release out anyway. You could argue why that could be allowed to happen, but people did tend to get a little bit heavy on that. The other thing about vanity metrics and are we really going any quicker, right? So I think a lot of this drive towards frequent releases in terms of actually measuring it and showing it as a metric in terms of how you're improving. Is that really the right thing to measure? Did we really deliver? We might have delivered change in a less risky way. Probably delivered things of value earlier on, right? So the number of things that we worked on spanned a number of different financial products. So as historically we'd release things when they're all done, we started releasing things when the first one was done, so getting value earlier. But a question that kind of kept on coming up and never really got answered, in my opinion, was, are we actually going any quicker by doing this? We can game with these metrics. I can release into different regions and say that's 3 different releases. So there's a sort of big question around about this point about whether we were mature enough to actually bin this metric, right? So instead of measuring the number of releases we're doing all the time, is there something better that we can manage? Having said that, at sort of early stages of the program, I thought it was absolutely essential to track that metric because it was an indication of how small your releases are, right? So it was important for a while, but were we really going any quicker? Were we measuring that? I think the final point there was, although you're going quick, were we building the right things all the time? Something, again, which I don't think was ever fully settled. Anyway, that's pretty much it. So I just wanted to end on a positive note. This is a couple of slides of sort of the sort of typical, this is actually an end of year process. So this is actual production data in terms of the number of releases that we pushed out. You can see there's a little bit of a peak here in November-ish, and it drops down to sort of 26. We released throughout this Christmas period here, and we did actually get up to 68 releases, I think there's 62 releases in a week.
You kept going to Nando's at the bottom there.
We did. Actually, Nando's has just started again. Nando's, maybe more in the Christmas time, we had a bit more time to push these things out. So, and this shows how, and this is the 12-week period of this DevOps pilot that I was referring to, right? I know we can't see completely what's going on here, but we've got the releases sort of climbing up a little bit here, really sort of jumping up after Christmas. But in terms of the percentage that were backed out or had an impact associated with them, you can see that pretty much leveled off. Okay. And that was it. So that's me. So as I said, I blog at agiledevil.com. If anyone wants to keep in touch, it's my email address, dicecenter.org. I'm on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. It's been interesting. I do like talking about this stuff. So be more than happy to come speak to any of you guys. That's it. Okay, thank you.